Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
Gobble, gobble, gobble. It's the Uncommon Good Thanksgiving weekend. Woo! I guess the weekend before.
Yeah.
This is the weekend before Thanksgiving where you can show your thankfulness through eating pie. And Bud, there are a few times that this ever happens throughout the year, but this is certainly one of them. So we're hoping that you're listening to us as you're running around, grabbing all of what you need for your Thanksgiving preparation, maybe watching some football beforehand, listening to us. But this is the Uncommon Good, and we are glad to be on the air. Over here I have Bud. What do you do when you're not being thankful eating turkey?
Yeah, I'm grateful, Bud Marr, and I am the academic dean overseeing liberal arts and sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences.
And when I am not giving myself a sugar and tryptophan coma, I am over at Mercy College as well, senior advisor for mission initiatives and the senior advisor for the Center for Human Flourishing. But I don't know if eating like we do on Thanksgiving in America is necessarily flourishing itself, but in the midst of it, it can seem like a flourishing good time.
Oh, yeah, I love Thanksgiving. It'd be hard to rank the holidays for me. They all have their special touches. But I think like jazz music and
where's this going?
Baseball, Thanksgiving is one of the great creations of the United States. I think Canada did copy off us. I think they tried to pull their own Thanksgiving. They run it a weird time of year.
That's right. And they're all like apologetic about it.
It really falls like in summer or something.
Do they have poutine at least? Because that would forgive, at least some of it. But what I will say that I'm truly thankful for, unlike Canadian Thanksgiving. No, I'm kidding. Good job, Canadians. But what I am thankful for is Mercy College of Health Sciences, who underwrites our show, mchs.edu. It is, of course, coming up on Thanksgiving. That means our students are beginning to wrap things up. Thanksgiving is always a sign in academia that you're reaching the finish line. So it's probably a little too late for you to start in spring, but certainly we have summer and fall beginnings, mchs.edu. Thank you, Mercy College, for underwriting the show. And like we said, good luck for everybody. Good work on all that you're doing to our students, mchs.edu. Are you figuring out when Canadian Thanksgiving is?
Yeah, I was wrong. I said summertime. October 9th still feels early.
Oh, so they tried to preempt us.
Yeah, they did. Well, but I was feeling grateful for Mercy College this week. Had to have my annual health checkup, which turns into a triannual health checkup to me. But, just seeing nurses draw blood and read heartbeats.
Oh, you're talking...
Check blood pressures.
Okay, you're not talking about the employee... Because I had the employee one, and they didn't check anything. So this is actually for your health, not... Okay. I was worried that you went to the wrong place for a second.
No, if you go to your employee health checkup at Mercy... Which is really just like, I think,
do you have tuberculosis?
A compliance thing.
Yeah.
If someone asks to draw your blood, run the other direction.
Well, look, I'll tell you one thing that you won't want to run away from, and you'll be thankful for, is who we have today on the show. Dr. John Cavadini, who is a professor of theology. He's also the McGrath Cavadini director, but if you have your own name in something, you're important, of the McGrath Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. Noted patristic scholar, well known for his takes on St. Augustine, to sort of top off, like a pumpkin pie, Bud, at the end of the Thanksgiving meal, to top off everything that we've done with St. Augustine's Confessions and the Radio Reading Roundup. We now get to interview him and hear from him, and it is going to be a jolly good time in which we're all thankful for. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. With the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We appreciate you listening to us and being with us, whether it's on iowacatholicradio.com, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, on air wherever you listen to Iowa Catholic Radio, and of course, on podcast of all our good listeners who catch it that way. Today, we're very excited on the show to have a very special guest, Dr. John Cavadini, the professor of theology and the Cavadini director, McGrath Institute for Church Life. You know you're important if your name is in your title. He is an expert on all sorts of things. The reason we've asked him here is because he's an expert on Augustine, and we're kind of doing a flashback to our radio reading roundup when we did St. Augustine's Confessions. This is a great way to top it off. John, thank you for being on the show with us. We have been excited and waiting to have this conversation with you for a while.
Sure. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I'm honored.
Well, I think a good way to begin all of this is the big question. What are the confessions? It's easy for us to sort of read back into an ancient text and think of it in terms of what we are used to. We've talked about John Henry Newman's autobiography. We think of memoirs that people write now, but we even think of spiritual sort of, reflections that people have about their life. But the confessions itself sort of begs the question for the reader to ask, what is it? And so let's just start with there off the bat. To your mind, what are the confessions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the closest thing to the confessions is the Psalms that Augustine infuses his text with. And so the Psalms have all kinds of voices, but the voice that predominates in the Psalms ultimately is praise. And I think that, so the confessions is a prayer. It's a prayer that tries to capture the spirit of the Psalms. It's a prayer that especially tries to voice, to give voice to praise and to ask the question, in doing so, what is the praise of God? And that comes up right at the beginning of the treatise, really. It's not a treatise. Bad. It's a prayer. It comes up right at the beginning of Book 1 in the prologue, which really is a prologue to the whole of the Confessions and not just to Book 1. He starts out by saying, Magnus est, you are great, O Lord, and greatly worthy of praise. That's the subject of the confession, God, and God's greatness, and God's praise. And then, he gives us a little sampling of what's to come. He asks the question, quid est, what are you, Lord? And then he gives us really fascinating and in his own way lovely and puzzling set of philosophical antitheses about how can we call God into ourselves, and isn't God too big to fit, and aren't we inside God, and where does this lead us? It leads us to the brink of language and conception, to the limits of it, as he concludes that God is something. What are you, God? You're something that's everywhere, whole at once, which is, wow, that's super cool. Wow, you are great and greatly to be praised. But Augustine doesn't stop there. So that must not be enough. And the reason that it's not enough, he's going to show us later in the Confessions. But this kind of philosophical discourse, basically, it gets the reaction I just gave. That's really cool. And guess what? You who said it must be really cool. So I'm going to praise you. And I can be talking about the praise of God in order, to actually elicit praise of myself, which is the sign of the deepest sin that Augustine exposes in the Confession, the sin of pride, which we can talk about if you want to later. But then he goes on to re-ask the question, what are you to me? Quid est mihi? And that's where he starts saying, the house of my soul is in ruins. Can you fix it? And all this kind of thing, where he begins to tell a story. And it's only as he tells that story that we find out what real praise is, because to tell the story is to confess, right? That's what the confessions are. It's a storytelling. It's offered to God. It's a prayer as a way of saying how great God is. And it's a lot harder to co-opt a story like that into praise for yourself. How about this? Here's the story. I'm confessing that you gave me myself, and I threw my whole self away. I completely threw it away, my precious self, for nothing, like the prodigal son, and you gave it back to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And it's that which is which is confession. It's both a confession of one's own sin, but it's a confession of God's mercy, and therefore a confession of God's praise. It's the sacrifice of praise that we're familiar with from the Psalms, and therefore it's that Augustine is registering that if true praise of God isn't just to answer the question, what are you, quid est? It's to answer the question, what are you to me? And to get personal. And he says to the Lord, when he asks that question, say to my soul, you are my salvation. Say to it so they can hear it. And in other words, so that it can respond and say, Lord, you are my salvation. This is what you mean to me.
I think what's interesting about that, too, is I love the idea, of course, that it's a story. And so it makes sense that when people often teach the confessions, they really focus on the first 9 books that are the most story-like, as it were. But what I find interesting is that then when he switches to book 10 through 13, and we get the very famous, very deeply philosophical and theological meditations on memory or time, or sort of the allegorical reading of the entire cosmos in the first few chapters of Genesis, what is allowed to happen is to say even the story, even my capacity to tell the story in the confessions is itself a confession of what you've done. So when he was willing to dive deep into something like the memory necessary to remember these first 9 chapters to sing your praises, or that time itself is this strange sort of thing that God allows so that we can live through it and sort of show the reality of his glory, even at his most philosophical, Augustine goes back to this basic point at the first: who is God? Who is he to me? And how can I best sing out in praise of what he's done? And so the book, to me, is much more unified sometimes than people seem to reflect. But, of course, that's something that you would expect from a rhetorician like Augustine.
Yeah. Well, if you think of Book 10, to begin with, Book 10 is bounded by the Eucharist. Like if you think Book 9 ends with Augustine bringing his reader to the altar to pray for his mother and his dad, and to the altar, that is to Mass. And then the book ends with the most poignant and beautiful evocation of the Eucharist, because as you remember, the way the book runs, it's not just a treatise about memory in the abstract, it's about what he remembers and how he remembers and how he finds God in his memory. And the basic way he finds God in his memory is by remembering all the stuff that he did wrong and all the stuff that he's tempted to now. And he says at the end, I'm just tempted to flee into the desert and just, but then he remembers what? He remembers God's mercy and how it's been lavished on him. He remembers that I eat it and I drink it and I minister it to others. And so what he's saying is, what are the boundaries of memory and how do you find God there? It's the Eucharist, the primal act of remembering God's mercy as it's made present, that bounds the memory and that has allowed him to remember what he's remembered without despairing. So it's turned obsession into confession, Eucharistic practice. And that's what then allows him to go on to offer an interpretation of the first 6 days of creation in books 11, 12, and 13, because the point is those books are created to praise God. And the only way that he can understand what those books mean is because he's had the experience of falling back into nothingness virtually and being saved by the mercy of God as he's experienced that in the Eucharist. And therefore, he can truly see the goodness of creation against the Manichees and offer an interpretation of Genesis 1, of the first 6 days of creation, that really is speaking forth praise and not just bragging.
Dr. Cavadini, this is Bud Marr. Thinking back to, stepping back for a moment to sort of like the historical background to the Confessions, I'm curious, like, how groundbreaking was this text? It seems like against the backdrop of most of the writing that we have from that time period, there wasn't really a lot of spiritual memoirs being written. And so the legacy of Augustine seems to be in a lot of ways like sort of the precursor to some of the great spiritual autobiographies that we love. But I'm kind of foggy on where I read this, but I think it's Harold Bloom who argues that Augustine almost frames the way that we think about personality and sort of like the individual in relation to the transcendent because of how groundbreaking this work was.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that to a large extent. I mean, if you think about somebody like Origen hardly ever mentions anything about himself, and Tertullian in the West virtually mentions nothing. You don't get any kind of, I think the reaction of Pelagius and his friends might help us understand how unique the Confessions was. Pelagius and friends were absolutely scandalized by the Confessions because Augustine doesn't think of his conversion as a one-moment affair. He thinks of his conversion as it's definitely marked by times that were more identifiable as conversion than others, but it's ongoing, right? That's what Book 10 is all about. He still has all these temptations. They're creepy ones, some of them. Like he admits that, even now he's addicted to praise. He's addicted not to false praise of himself, but to true praise of himself. He wants it. And he's fascinated by spiders eating flies. I mean, these kinds of curiositas, so that's a vice. And so the fact that he's willing to put that out there as a bishop of the church scandalized Pelagius and all other manner of perfectionists who thought, hey, you're converted, you were baptized, and that's that. What kind of a Christian are you? It reminds me of the bird in Peter and the Wolf looking at the duck and saying, what kind of bird are you that can't fly? I mean, it's like, what kind of Christian are you that is so mediocre and is willing to put it out there? So the idea that life wasn't just a fixed achievement, or consist of a fixed achievement to attain and then to talk about as attained was itself a break with, I think, a lot of spiritual tradition, basically with the heroic tradition of classical antiquity, just an utter break with it. And Pelagius, you could say, is our sort of, I don't know, he's sort of like the fall guy in the comedy, or I don't know. That's not a good way of looking at it, but or maybe the straight man, like just completely scandalized by this lavish outpouring of confession.
Oh, that Pelagius is sort of being the foil that makes this occur is a really interesting point. And it makes me think in sharp relief that Augustine sort of knows, right, that he's been addicted to praise his entire life, and here he is, a bishop sitting on the precipice of an entire new group of people praising him. And so he can't be a monk. There's, we can throw out reasons like, why couldn't he be? But the circumstances have made it such that he's not going to be a monk. He can't run away from the cave and away from the eyes of the world. So there's a way in which he has to, in his mind, jump headlong into the deep end of being well known. And it's like, if I'm going to avoid vanity, then I have to make myself so perfectly well known that everybody sees all of the warts and the difficulties so that they don't have the wrong sort of praise for me. It's almost like he's at a crossroads and he sees that he can't go hide from the vanity that led him astray the first time, as it were. So he's going to double down on embodying all eyes upon himself, but he's going to do it for the sake of showing his sins in order to show the glory of God.
Yeah, I could drink to
that. Well, in that regard, too, I think one way that we can think about that is sometimes people don't understand, Augustine's a rhetorician, so I think maybe people think, oh, that's like a retiring, bookish professor. But the sort of political temptation that rhetoricians at his time would have, I think that he's more maybe of a careerist than people might understand. And there's actually a lot more of St. Augustine. We might feel like, oh, well, he doesn't really relate to me because I'm not like a profligate sexual sinner or whatever. But his ambitions towards a career might be one of the first and foremost ways that people can relate to him.
Well, I mean, absolutely. I mean, in the first case, rhetoric in the ancient world was an art, and it was a very public art. And you could think of prominent rhetors almost as equivalent to rock stars. People tried to touch them. People tried to take their clothes. I mean, we've lost this art completely as the art of public speaking. But it was one of the hugest public displays that, to fascinated audience to passionately argue for one position and have everybody convinced and clapping, and then turn around and passionately argue for the opposite position and have everyone else then equally convinced and astonished that you could do that. But anyway, basically, that it was the key to success in the ancient world, because rhetoric was the art also of the lawyer, right? The lawyer was the person who could plead a case and plead it successfully. And the person who could teach rhetoric was also someone who, had huge cultural prestige. And Augustine got the highest chair of rhetoric in the empire, at least in the Western Empire. He got an imperial chair endowed by the emperor, and in residence in Milan, where the emperor was, to be able to speak on public occasions on behalf of the emperor and, of course, to praise the emperor. So, he got what he wanted in life, or what he thought he wanted in life, and he inexorably set his sights on that. There is that stereotype of Augustine the sexual sinner. I don't think it's a very helpful stereotype. First of all, it's prone to the fact that, like Nietzsche said at one point, you don't have much to show for it, big guy. You got a lot of rhetoric, but you don't have a lot to show for it. In fact, he had a common law wife, sometimes called a concubine or whatever, but this is a perfectly respectable arrangement in the empire, a sort of lower class marriage. He was faithful to her and says it in the Confessions and elsewhere for, I think it's 18 years. They had a child. They tried not to have a child because he was a Manichaean, and they let you get married if you were in the auditors, the lower level of them, but you weren't supposed to have children. So they tried not to, but they had one, and of course that was the love of Augustine's life. He brags about that kid in the Confessions and in the De Magistro. He's the only church father that's actually a literal dad who brags about his kid. It's very endearing. But part of what makes it endearing is, if you think about it, he did why did he feel he had to become celibate when he was converted to the church and to be baptized? It's because he had a family life and he blew it up on the basis of career. He knew, and his mother also, he blames his mother as well, for being so fixated on a successful career that it meant that he had to have a better marriage, right? A more successful and more upper crust marriage. So he sent his wife away, and he says it broke my heart to let it bleed. And he said, but I was no woman. She went off and became a nun. He knows that. And he says, but I wasn't a woman. In other words, I wasn't going to follow her good example. He was insulted. And he took up with somebody else. Meanwhile, because the woman that he was supposed to get married to was only 12. So she had to wait till she was of marriageable age. So he did take up with some other woman. We don't know the name. So that's where the sexual profligacy comes in. But it comes in because he's bound and determined to get a prestigious job, and the highest prestigious job. And this is what he throws his whole self away for. And I think that's much more relatable to dads today. Dads today are tempted to, in one way or another, neglect their family on the basis of career, often thinking it's good for their family.
No, I think that is a powerful insight that is, I have to say, Bud, you tell me have you ever heard anyone bring that up in the myriad times we've had that caught in
No,
class?
that was great, yeah.
So Bud and I feel like geniuses for making sure to have you on the show to point that out.
We really made this happen.
Yes, thank you. So we're coming up on the first break, so I think we should leave it there. When we get back, more of this insightful talk about St. Augustine's Confessions with Dr. John Cavadini from Notre Dame. You need to make sure to stick around. We'll be back right after this. With the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It is so wonderful to have all of you with us. To get right to it, we're going to continue our interview with Dr. John Cavadini, Professor of Theology, the McGrath Cavadini Director, McGrath Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame. Once again, John, thank you for joining the show to talk to us about St. Augustine's Confessions.
Sure. Thank you for welcoming me.
All right, Bud, I'm going to throw it over to you. I'm sure you have a real easy question for him.
Well, Dr. Cavadini, during the last segment, you touched on these ideas about Augustine as a sexual sinner and sort of like what was involved in his life. And there's all sorts of ideas that I think people have at sort of a sometimes a shallow level, or they misunderstand maybe the nuance of what's going on there. I think another place where that's the case, and maybe it's because where I come from, I grew up an evangelical Protestant, and Protestants, Augustine is one of the church fathers that they really try to claim and say, in some ways, like his arguments belong to us. And so there's a lot of conversations about St. Augustine's understanding or his theology of grace. Could you talk some about how he discusses grace in the Confessions, and maybe, I know there's some key points in his life, like I'm thinking even of the incident where he steals some fruit that I think illumine how Augustine is thinking about grace in this book.
Yeah, I would love to talk about the pear tree incident, but when I think of grace in the Confessions, my mind is drawn to Book 7 and Book 8. Book 8 in particular, but Book 7, Book 7 is where he talks about reading the Platonic books and coming to certain kinds of insights based on them. You might even say mystical experience. But he says that he couldn't cling because he didn't know Jesus. He didn't know the gospel that God had bent down to us, which is the supreme instance of grace. And he didn't have the way, even though he says he, to some extent, recognized the goal. All right, so you end with Book 7. So philosophy, which is supposed to be the thing that leads you to wisdom, is a big flop, basically. Maybe that's exaggerating. Okay, I'm an exaggerator. And then you get to Book 8, which is in many ways, that's sort of like, I think if people think of a conversion moment, it's in Book 8 with the take up and read. But if you think about Book 8, it's so, in a way, disarming and unprepossessing. Like, after the sort of heights of Neoplatonic philosophy and all the stuff explained in Book 7, which actually was powerless to get him over the line, as it were. What happens in Book 8 is this really, you could say, lowbrow swapping of stories. Book 8 is just telling stories. Yeah. Well, what happened to Victorinus? Like, Victorinus' story of his conversion, and then there's Saint Anthony, and then these two officials. But if you watch the progress, if you watch it closely, what's interesting is that take Victorinus. All right, what's Victorinus, like, his story? Like, what's his deal? Like, he's a super famous Neoplatonist Christian. Well, he wasn't a Christian yet, but he says to Simplicianus, who succeeded Ambrose as bishop, but he wasn't bishop yet. Simplicianus is trying to get him to go to church, and Victorinus says, "Well, I already am a Christian." And Simplicianus says, "Well, I'm not going to believe that till I see you in church." And Victorinus would say, "Well, is it the four walls that make a Christian?" And they have this little banter back and forth. But there's a lot of significant things here, because as the story goes on, Augustine talks about how Victorinus considered passages like, "If you deny me before men, I will deny you," etc. And he drank in courage, he says. And suddenly he was on fire to go to church. So one thing is, you're not converted until you go to church, you're not converted until you receive the sacraments, until you receive, baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist. That's what conversion amounts to, first of all. And secondly, why would he be reluctant? Because the church is so unprepossessing. It's not a group of philosophers. It's not an enlightened organization. It's full of ordinary people, like that were in that basilica that night, that Easter night that he did receive baptism. And the thing about it is, like Augustine talks about, this was the work of grace. He does it subtly, but he says it explicitly. And so what you see there is the mystery of grace and the mystery of human freedom completely intertwined, not reduced to each other, but completely intertwined. Because where did his courage come from? He suddenly drank in courage, and expressions like that. And we're totally familiar with these kinds of things happening, right? People suddenly get inspired. They suddenly get, it's totally believable on a kind of horizontal plane of human causality. And yet, when he sums up in Book 9 at the beginning, he says, where was my free will all this time that your grace drew it forth? And so the idea being, people are used to pitting grace and free will against each other. But what Augustine shows, and I think this is his most persuasive place, is that the mystery of freedom is illuminated only sufficiently by the mystery of grace, and the mystery of grace is illuminated only sufficiently by the mystery of freedom. They're both ultimately mysterious, and yet they operate together. It's grace that frees our will, and it's in our freedom that we're in our struggles for freedom, and in our freedom that we experience grace. And so the way in which the utterly believable stories, like reading the life of Saint Anthony, Augustine is like on fire. Like, this guy just read something in the Bible and he heard it applied to him. And like, why can't I do that? Mm-hmm. And this is what he starts crying about, like the soldiers who the imperial officials who heard the story and told their stories, like they immediately decided, they drank in courage. They suddenly, but this is like the work of grace. Do you see the work of grace? No, it's invisible. Can you say with any certainty, this is the most great moment of grace? You can't really, but the closest you can come is that it's experienced in and as a moment of freedom, and really a moment of, and not freedom. It's not freedom like get out of jail free card. It's freedom to embrace a new life of struggle, and which is supported by grace all the way, so that you get this beautiful, like unphilosophical account of storytelling, and it's in the storytelling that the grace is operative. These are stories of grace, and these are what finally get Augustine into that garden and make him break down and cry. And suddenly he hears something very ordinary, two kids or a kid playing a game, and he takes it, this is grace, right? He takes it as an opportunity. He runs and reads the Bible, and the verse that he lights on speaks to his heart. And all of his anxiety is gone, and he's free to embrace the life of baptism and to join the church without, the impediments of pride, etc.
So this is fantastic, because Book 7 and 8, you can actually ask Bud this. I'm on record. I think 7 is one of the most underrated chapters because of how it sets up 8. But to steal some of the arguments from our mutual friend Brett Robinson, I think it's interesting that at the dawn of the printing press age, they go back and read Book 8 and really fix in on the guy reading a text once, where if they would open their aperture, think more scripturally, orality, this was just a book of, hagiography saved his life. And that moment about him reading the book, like you said, is a parallel of what happens in the story of St. Anthony. So a similar thing, of course, happens in Book 7, where Augustine almost sounds like he's saying what Descartes says. Descartes famously, I think, therefore I am, sets up the whole modern world in a sort of geographic, textual way. But St. Augustine says, I knew that I existed because I willed things and I wanted things, and who else was willing them but me? And so grace as this thing that draws us out of ourselves. I mean, all desire draws us out of ourselves, but for Augustine, it's what's drawing us out of ourselves and towards what that makes the final determination of what sort of person you are. And so grace is that which draws our will towards God and shows up, like you said, in completely interesting, surprising, and like you said, quote unquote, low-brow ways. It's just stories of God intervening with his people. And to me, that tracks with this larger theme that Augustine has. He's obsessed with language all the way through. He's really worried, of course, that rhetoric and learning to speak well, his job, of course, that, like we've said, made him vain. He's worried that he's going to lead other people astray, or it will lead other people astray. But then paradoxically, of course, it's his brilliant way of speaking, his wonderful way of bringing forth analogies and metaphors that really gets at the heart of why his work is so powerful. So I think that that's sort of what is missing sometimes when we very flatly read Augustine as a guy who picked up the book, and then Grace, like Bud's saying, is this sort of jackhammer that solves all problems. Augustine sees it as something much more, not only subtle, but frankly beautiful and much more refulgent.
Also much more intimate. It's as intimate to us as our own freedom is, even more intimate. And therefore it's as mysterious to us as our own freedom is, even more mysterious. I think the most graced conversation that we see in the Confessions is the one between him and his mother in Book 9. It's famous, but I think, that's the most lowbrow conversation you can imagine, right? But it's also the most unlikely conversation you can imagine, because here's a guy who's super you might even say I think Jim O'Donnell says that, over-educated guy, and there's his mom, who's not educated at all, maybe not even literate. I don't remember. But, and then he's a man, she's a woman, and he's a young guy. She's older, she's old, she's elderly, or a widow. And the thing is, they shouldn't even be able to communicate with each other. Mm. And Augustine, instead of thinking, well, this is an educated person, I'm a professor, for goodness sake, I'm a PhD. I'm going to say my best insights for academic conferences, not for my mom or my students who appreciate it. And his mother could be thinking, obversely, well, I'm too embarrassed to talk in front of my son. He knows everything. He's been educated. He was the emperor's chief rhetorician, etc. But what happens is they just start talking. Like, hey, what's the life of the saints going to be like? Man, it's going to be cool. Don't you think it's going to be this? It's going to be so wonderful, like this sort of forgetfulness of self and in a conversation about eschatological hope as promised. And in the conversation, this is often missed when that passage is treated. It's not that they, stop talking and then have a mystical insight and start talking again. He's very clear. While we were speaking, we touched the edge of wisdom. And so it's what baptism makes possible, what membership in the church makes possible, is a communion, is a new culture of conversation, which is not based on pride and not based on prestige, but is based on the hope that the sacrifice of Christ gives us, formed in us by the Eucharist. And so we can have these conversations which arise from the grace of the Eucharist, which arise from the grace of God's providence knowing, so that all of a sudden both of them forgot themselves and they just started in this completely, you could say, lowbrow conversation that we recognize all the time. Really, that's going to be so cool, don't you think? What is it going to be? What's the life of the saints going to be like?
Amen.
Well, we mentioned briefly that incident with the pear tree, and this is one of the more famous, I think, parts of the book. But I guess if you could, Dr. Cavadini, provide a brief synopsis for our listeners, but more importantly, how does that story function in the overall narrative? It seems to be in part him unpacking this whole notion of disordered desire and the mystery of the human propensity to sin, right?
Oh yeah, you could say it's an allegorical story in some ways, but so the basic story is Augustine tells the story of him and a few of his, evil adolescent friends. They went out and had this great idea one night. Hey, let's go and steal some pears. Of course, they have to do it in the dead of night because they don't want to get in trouble. They're too cowardly. So they do it in the dead of night. They go out and they steal a bunch of pears. They pull them off a tree, and Augustine makes it super clear. I had better pears at home. We all did. We didn't even eat the pears. We just threw them away, and we did it basically just to break the law and for the pleasure of breaking the law, for the pleasure of the malice involved in it. And we actually did it because we were too embarrassed, each of us, not to do it. When somebody said, "Come on, let's go," then I was too embarrassed to say, "No, that's not right," or whatever. And so you can now, Augustine presents this little scene, and people again, people like Nietzsche have looked at it and say, these ancient razors, they make a mountain out of a molehill. Like it was just, or it gets ceaselessly psychoanalyzed. It got him feeling guilty about some stupid thing he did as a kid. It's not about feeling guilty, and it's not about obsessing. It's about offering us a window into, you could use Hannah Arendt's phrase, the venality of human evil,
right.
But you could also use the phrase, the irrationality of sin and of evil. Because as he's introducing that passage, now he's, in retrospect, what is he doing? He's lifting up the passage and he's saying, well, why did we do it actually? There wasn't any obvious good that we got from it. We didn't eat the pears. We threw them away. So there wasn't, the whole point is that it's a trivial incident, so that it actually allows you, it gives you a window into what original sin is, what Adam and Eve did. Because Adam and Eve, if you think about it, and he evokes the scene later in the City of God, they had everything they could possibly have wanted. Everything. There wasn't anything that they lacked. They had enough food all the time. They had interesting work, but it wasn't, it wasn't a grind. They had each other. They were naked. They could have had sex all the time. Maybe they did. Who knows? Why? And God says, okay, and you know what? Just one little thing. Like, don't eat that one little fruit over there on that tree. Just what's the motive for that they went and did it? Anyway, why? There was nothing, he shows you, that they could have gained by disobedience that they couldn't have gained by obedience. And the little story about the pear tree shows you is a little parable, right? Why did we do this? We had everything we needed and wanted, and we didn't use the pears. And he says, therefore, it's a completely irrational decision. And he starts out the whole thing by saying, I was in love with my own destruction. Amavi periri. I was in love with perishing. It shows you the complete irrationality of sin. But he does give it a name, and the name is pride. Mm. The name is pride, and what pride means is that Adam and Eve, like Adam, okay, so he got all this stuff. He even saw God give him a lot of this stuff, and he knows where it came from, and he knows where Eve came from, the person he had sex with or could have sex with, at least, and he knows all this stuff, and God says, okay, just as a reminder, kind of, that I gave it to you. Just don't eat that.
Just a little note.
That one. Yeah, it's so easy. Just don't eat that one thing. And they go right up to it. I'm exaggerating. I always do. And pluck it off and eat it. It's like saying, thanks, but no thanks, big guy. I want it on my own terms. I'll have it on my terms or no terms. And of course, that's to be in love with your own destruction, because your terms are nihilistic. Your terms are not the other fallen person's terms, or the other fallen person. There are no terms once you discard God's terms. And so the little pear tree incident shows you that by parallel, they wanted their own order. They didn't want the law. They wanted to be their own lawmakers. But it's a shadowy parody of omnipotence, that is, of the ability to make law, because they have to do it at night. There's no real freedom there. All there is you want to see what the society bent on prestige looks like? It looks like a bunch of guys who went out at night and said, come on, let's do it. And then he started saying, yeah, you were awesome. You got that pear at the top of the tree. Really good. It's a lot easier to get the pear at the top of somebody else's tree and brag about it in the middle of the night than it is actually to be virtuous and loving and to praise God in your virtue and in your loving and in your confession. So that's a little bit of he turns it into an allegory to show that Plato was wrong. Just because you know the good doesn't mean you're going to do it. And you can do an action out of malice, period, pure malice. And I think for Augustine, sin is, you could say, a kind of an addiction. And that's why we kind of need something. You can't just jump out of an addiction. Well, that's what the Eucharist is. It's the opposite addiction, right? Mm. It gives us a sweetness to become addicted to slowly, so that it's like a lollipop. I mean, I don't mean to insult the Eucharist, but it's like something to give you pleasure that's a good pleasure, that eventually what you're doing is falling in love with the whole order of the universe, the Logos himself, that you threw away. But now he's presented himself in such a beguiling and charming and beautiful and utterly lovable way, and you get addicted to that by communion. The whole confessions, although the Eucharist doesn't play a big rhetorical or a flashy role in it, it actually undergirds the whole thing, because the Eucharist is our learning to stop being in love with our own perdition and destruction and to start loving the one who gave himself and put himself at our feet. Wow, that starts to get to you, right? It starts to work at you. And the more you're nourished by it, the more you give yourself or let him give himself to you, the more you become able to say, you are great, O Lord, and greatly worthy of praise.
Well, we're reaching the end of the segment here. That is a fantastic way to finish it up. I think about Augustine saying, why do things come into existence and pass out of existence in time? Why are there these dark moments, interspersed with light? And the last metaphor he makes to this is, well, that's how language works, right? There aren't words unless there's pauses in between. And so I love how you say that sort of in between the entire arc of the Confessions is the grammar of the Eucharist, the grammar of thanksgiving, the grammar of bringing our hearts back to rest in
memory.
God. Yes, the memory that undergirds that. It's a beautiful way to wrap this up. So Dr. Cavadini, if you don't mind, if you want to throw people in a direction to see the work that the McGrath Life Institute is doing, where can people go check that out?
Well, you can check it out on our website, mcgrath.nd.edu. Or you can email me.
I think if you just look, John,
a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, a lot of great stuff. I would really suggest everybody go do that. Dr. John Cavadini, thank you for being on the show. It has been a fantastic time and a wonderful pleasure. Thank you for letting us interview on St. Augustine.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. We hope you have a thankful Thanksgiving. And Bud, speaking of being thankful, that, my friend, was an amazing interview. I'm so glad that we had Dr. John Cavadini, director of the McGrath Life Center at University of Notre Dame. What a way to cap off just this semester. A great portion of this fall, we were considering St. Augustine. So to be able to top it off with having Dr. Cavadini come in, perfect.
Yeah, that was great. Don't tell Rachel. It kind of makes me want to go back to school. I don't know if I could get into Notre Dame or not, but it would be great to study with Dr. Cavadini and catch as much of his wisdom as you can before he retires.
He's also just having a good time. That's one thing too, right? If you have someone who loves St. Augustine and is just having a rollicking good time about it, you've came to the right place.
I think in education, we do need to try to have more of a good time more often. Like,
you want to learn to juggle when we're in class?
If you need to juggle to hold the student's attention, I feel like that's incumbent upon the professor, but I don't know. If you're not passionate about your subject matter and happy to be there.
That absolutely is true. But something that I think we should all be passionate about here on Iowa Catholic Radio is joining together in prayer. If you don't mind, let the good people know out there where they can join us in such prayers.
Please do join our prayer life here at Iowa Catholic Radio. We broadcast the Rosary on air at 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., then the Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon. You can also use the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
If you go to iowacatholicradio.com, there's an end-of-the-year appeal to try to, of course, raise the funds that we need to for the end of the year. I want to really emphasize that, iowacatholicradio.com. You can donate there. You can donate at 515-223-1150 by calling or texting. But really, event-wise, the one that's coming up, everyone should have in mind after Thanksgiving, shortly after there, I should say, December 8th, right? Des Moines, 6 p.m., the Embassy Suites downtown. Dinner in December with Dr. David Anders. Go to iowacatholicradio.com to check all of that out. But we're not able to have things like the dinner in December or wonderful interviews with John Cavadini on shows like ours unless we are able to support the radio. So please, please, please hear, as you think about all the blessings you have and what you're thankful for, please hear at the end of the year, prayerfully consider donating to iowacatholicradio.com. We appreciate your prayers. We appreciate your volunteering. We appreciate all that you do and all that you give, but we would be remiss if we didn't one more time beg you folks of your prayers. Bud, I hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I hope you splurge in I don't know, a moderate amount, but, a reasonable amount. I hope you have a great time with the family.
No, safe travels on the road. And next time we're together, hopefully we're thankful for an Iowa victory.
Oh, is that it? I thought they're playing you guys.
I meant to say Nebraska victory over Iowa, but I guess that was a slip of sorts.
You're just being very nice. But to also be nice, this is the Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. We're very thankful for you all. This is the Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.